So we have today Felipe Arturo with us. He's an artist born in Bogotá in 1979. He studied architecture at Universidad de Los Andes, received a master's from Columbia University in, I'm not sure what year. And are you currently a PhD candidate at Universidad de Évora? Is that correct, Felipe? Cool.
That's correct.
Okay. That's in Schwartz. Cool. And I mean, very amazing work that you'll be sharing with us. But just to name a few shows or noteworthy things you've partook in, you received the Premio Luis Caballero 2016-17, and you were in the Cartagena Biennial 2014. You were in the Bienal de Arte Naif in the State of Sao Paulo in 2012. Bienal de Lyon, France, 2019. You've had projects for the Botanical Garden of Bogotá in 2005, Fragmentos-Espacio de Arte y Memoria 2019, Plaza de Bolivar 2016, and the list goes on. But I think maybe we can just jump into your work. I don't know, I could list more shows and collections, but then I'm just bragging. Yeah, do you want to start, Felipe?
Yes. Okay. So hello, everybody, and thank you to the Yale School of the Art Sculpture Program for this invitation. I'm very excited to be today with you, and I hope I'll meet with some of you next week. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Aki, for facilitating this invitation. We're doing some kind of exchange in this pandemic time. So Aki will be talking in a master program I work with here in Bogotá in the following weeks. And I think this is a very interesting and creative way of dealing with these difficult times for everybody in the arts and academia especially. I just want to complement that introduction saying that I'm not only an artist, I sometimes work designing exhibitions in, let's say, some experimental approach to museography and the tools and the, let's say, artifacts that are behind an exhibition. And these have been central to my practice as well. And also I worked some years ago for other artists. And I knew, let's say, about artistic practice within the practice of others. And this had been also very important to the work that I have been doing in the last years. My first work I did when I was an architecture student in 1999. And since then I've been like working in different places and different contexts. And it's over like 2 decades now. And I'm only going to show 5 projects today. They are not like comprehensive of my whole practice, but I wanted to show this in which I spent like the most of the time. And that have been projects that I've been doing like continuously for several years. So let's start with this presentation. Let me share my screen. So I'm gonna switch from this presentation to some videos. So I ask for your patience doing these transitions from one program to the other. I'm not seeing you right now. So if the image stops or I lose or you lost my sound or something, you have to talk to me. So I want to start with this project, which I called Agua del Pacífico. That means water from the Pacific. I have to start telling you that I did an MFA at Columbia University in New York, and I spent my second year doing let's say librarian research on the history of rubber extraction in the Amazon basin. And right after graduation, I got a travel grant to do a kind of journey through Amazonian cities that were like central into this time of rubber extraction and exportation. When I got to the Amazon basin, I discovered that rubber, it wasn't central anymore to let's say the everyday of these places, these towns and cities, but it left like a profound trace in the culture of this region. And I discovered that water was like a central element, not only to, let's say, like a human living here, but also like in the shape of this territory that is like the northern part of South America. And I discovered that these lines of waters that you can see here in this map were like traces of the geological history of this territory, and then they determined like all the possible connections across this land. I did this map myself because I liked to highlight this, how this territory is traversed by these water bodies, these bodies of water, either as big rivers or like springs, like being born in different mountain systems. I like this map a lot because it's a map without borders. So you can see how these rivers go across what we call now like national countries. And I really wanted to confront this idea of nationality or political borders that are like abstracted regions within a topographical and geological region that know about like political divisions. In this travel, I thought about connecting like the two oceans that are like on two sides of the American continent. One is the Pacific Ocean and the other is the Atlantic Ocean. And I wanted to confront this information I had from history books and botanic books that I had access in New York with a life experience in this place. Many people compare this, let's say, this system of rivers with a neuronal network, or like this kind of schematic representation of the brain and the way like thoughts are produced and emotions are produced within a sensorial structure of the body. And I like to think of myself like going through this travel as a thought in the continent. For the projects I'm going to show, I don't know if you see my pointer here, but I want to locate some of the cities in which later on, I conduct some projects. So in the middle, there is Manaus, that is like the biggest city in the Amazon basin. And over here is Iquitos, that is a Peruvian city on the Amazon River. And here near the mouth of the river on the Atlantic Ocean, there is Belém do Pará, that is a city that was established in the 19th century. And it was like the biggest port sending this raw material of rubber to Europe and North America. So let me switch to a video that is here. So along this trip, I did this project in which I was using water as a photographic lens. I took the first volume of water in the Pacific Ocean, and along my travel, I was exchanging waters in different rivers. My idea was to have like a sample of one sample of water of one of the like main mountain systems in the continent. And then through the trip, I was, let's say, doing like a documentation of the travel. But this documentation was trying to avoid like the precision of documentary work. And I was focusing more in the materiality of water, and also exchanging this water in different rivers was a way of intervening with this system of waters with my own, let's say, movement. The trip took 4 months, and for me it was essential to give back the first volume of water that I took on the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, and in a way to break with this tradition of extracting raw materials from a territory, and then to engage into a system of exchange in which I will extract a little volume of water, but then I will give it back to the ocean. So after producing this documentation, I've been showing this work in 2 different forms. One is like the video that you just saw, that it was like quicker than when I usually show it. And I also like to focus on certain images that in a way show like different aspects of this project. So I really like this image because you can see how in the mountains, rivers are born through the condensation of the clouds. This is very interesting because in the last decades, there is this finding that there are like rivers, like currents of water going on the air. So there's a system of particles of water that goes through different continents and that connect like different places in the earth. And they are interconnected as the rivers in the map that I show you. So it's very, I mean, it was like a very interesting, very, I will say, emotional experience to be like in the peaks of the mountains of the Andes and to see how like a river starts And afterwards, you will see how the Amazon River became like this huge collector of waters from different sources. I also learned that we used to think about nature and the Amazonian territory as a place without humans. And one of the conclusions of this trip is that we cannot disconnect like social systems with nature systems. And in this territory, we have been seeing there had been like people living for millennia, and oftenly we hear about the let's say conservation of the Amazon as a place without people. So on each river, I will find like several interactions from different people, being towns or big cities. And I think we have to reconsider this idea of nature as something that is autonomous and something that is, let's say, outside humanity. I also learned that colonial processes are still going on. In this picture, in a city that is called Puerto Maldonado. This is in the border of Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. And you can see this line in the middle, which is a road that is just being built. And it goes into the forest, and probably it will connect with another town or city some kilometers away. This is another road that is called in Portuguese is Trans-Amazonica. It's let's say a utopical project from the military dictatorship in Brazil that was planned in the 60s, and now it's being completed. So the idea it had the idea of connecting the major cities in Brazil with this region, but also connecting the two oceans. And now it's like the biggest highway to take out products and raw materials to the Pacific ports, and especially to export them to China. So the existence of this road really, let's say, inaugurates like another stage in the colonial history of the Amazon basin. One of the consequences of these roads are the expansion of monocrops. So I really like this picture because in the middle you see the highway that is inverted by the optical illusion of that creates water. On the left, you can see the jungle, let's say, like the forest with like 1 million types of species. And on your right, you can see a bit of a sugarcane plantation that had been expanded in these Amazonian territories to produce sugar, but also to produce ethanol. So Brazil had this idea to be autonomous in the consumption of I don't know, I forgot the word combustibles. I don't know the name in English. So they are producing enormous amounts of ethanol that it's let's say a fuel that comes from sugar cane. In this trip I also took like water back to the air over the clouds, and I like this picture because still today some of these towns and cities are only reachable through the air or through water. Many of those are still, they don't have connections, like road connections between themselves, which is in a way good, because that in a way protects some territory, some of these territories from the colonial expansion, but also keeps like many communities in isolation. So I think it's like it's very difficult to be judgmental with the communities that live right now in Amazonia. This picture, it's in Manaus. It's the city that it's like in the, let's say, geographical center of the Amazon basin. And behind water, we can see here blurred the Opera House of Manaus. That it was a very iconic building from the rubber times. So I'll talk about it later. I also learned that geological history is can be traced in particles of water. So it was interesting how after some weeks or months traveling, these particles will reveal sometimes in some moments. And focusing the gaze of these images in the materiality of water could like give another kind of information that is there, but we're not very conscious of it. I also learned how there are many patterns that arrived in rubber times and that somehow spread and disseminated in different places in the region. And this became like influential to other projects that I will show you later. And also I learned about like the spaces in boats and ships that became like very important in this process of like Western expansion in Amazonian territories. And even today, like many cities use these systems to transport goods and people in trips that are like sometimes 3 or 5 days long between one city and the other. And I took many of these ships in my trip, and I had it was like a very interesting way of like moving through rivers and also to get into a different, let's say, time traveling. Doing this like exercise of taking water into this jar and using it as a lens also show how water in a way inverts the horizon. So in many of these pictures, you can see how the river becomes the sky becomes the river. And in a way, this metaphorically make us think of other histories or how to alternate our, like, let's say, common grounds on the history of certain places. I also passed through ports, which were also fundamental in this history of extraction. And I also met many like settlers and migrants, which is probably the key factor in the transformation of the Amazonian basin in the last 2 centuries. So right now there are like 40 million people living in this territory that is shared by 9 countries. And these people that migrated into the Amazon basin really engage with, let's say, Amazonian cultures, but also brought their own cultures and created like a very, I don't know, unique culture, which is really reshaping this territory. I will focus on that in another project that I'm gonna show you. After some months, I saw one of these rubber trees being cut. It's not a practice that is done like massively as it was in the 19th century, but it's really incredible to see like how these latex cut from a tree and how the, let's say, the development, like industrial development of many products and materials that we use every day are coming from a tree and change in a way the history of a whole territory, and also put the basis for a global economy 150 years before we could talk about like globalization. So it was like really interesting after reading a lot about this history to actually find the way in which we extract raw materials from vegetal beings. One of the main traces in these cities from Robert times are these Portuguese tiles. So this was very, let's say, it created the base for a cultural exchange in which these boats were shipping rubber from, let's say, from Manaus and Iquitos and Belém. And when the boats were coming back from Europe, they were like bringing many materials, not only food, but also construction materials, like these Portuguese tiles. And in a way, many of these cities are covered with these traces from the 19th century, and they were transformed and adapted and recreated through, let's say, industrial means. So this idea of like covering a surface with a tile, it gives the architecture in these cities like, let's say, a facade which carries this history of the exchange of raw material for a cultural item. Near the mouth of the river, you can actually see how the river collects water from different sources until it's so big that you cannot see the other side of the river. And then what I was trying to do optically with water, it happened naturally through the fading of river and sky. And after 4 months, I got to the other side of the continent, and I gave back water to the ocean, as I was telling you. So for me, that travel became like, let's say, like a foundational journey in my practice. And from many of these encounters, I work and I did research, and I came back to some of these places, and I produce other works that I want to show you. So one of these is Tropicon Tropicum, and is based on this natural phenomena that occurs, let's say, perpetually near Manaus, and it's the encounter of two different rivers. One is the Amazon River, that is this ochre colored river, and the other one is Rio Negro, that is a black river. So the Amazon River, until this point, brings water from the Andean mountain range, and the Black River, or Rio Negro, brings water from the Guyanese Shield. And when these two rivers find each other, they don't mix immediately, but they, in a way, run together for 10 kilometers without mixing. And this is because the geological nature of each of these rivers, one is neutral and the other one is acid. So it's like a very impressive experience to go over this river of two colors. I just want to show you how it's transversing this meeting of waters. So the square that you were watching at the end of the video is this square. It's called Praça do São Sebastião, or Encontro das Águas, which means the encounter of the waters. It's a square made with these stones that were brought from Portugal in the same boats that were taking the rubber outside the basin. And it copied this pattern of white and black waves from another square that is in Lisbon, in Portugal, which is called Praça do Rocio. And both squares were made in the 19th century. This one in Manaus was made like 20 years after the one in Lisboa. And the people of Manaus, especially like these robber barons, wanted to commemorate this natural phenomena that was occurring right near Manaus with the encounter of these two rivers. And for me, the existence of this square in a way illustrates this triangle of colonial exchange of raw materials for cultural artifacts. So I wanted to work about this square. I spent like 3 years trying to find a space that will produce this work with me. And finally, I found in 2013 an art space in a city that is called Cali, here in Colombia, in which I reproduced this pattern, this floor pattern, but this time I was using white sugar and raw sugar or brown sugar. I don't know how you call it. So my idea was to relate this square, that it was linked to the history of rubber, with this other material that also brings a narrative of colonial exchange and colonial production. This time of sugar that was central to the early days of the Spanish and Portuguese invasion of the American continent. So after this, I did this work like in several places. This was in another city that is called Cartagena here in Colombia as well. This time I did it with sand, that the yellow sand that comes from the mountains, and the gray sand comes from the beach. And then I produce it like in different scales. This was in another exhibition here in Bogotá. And this one was done actually this year during lockdown in a museum in Marrakesh in Morocco. So for me, it's interesting how this pattern and this work can be, let's say, adapted to different spaces and situations. And it can create a space by its own, and also create this idea of an urban space within an exhibition space. These floors are made with these metal molds. And in a way, the mold is not only an instrument to create the work, but it's also a reminder of this idea of a colonial pattern. In exhibition spaces, let's say closed spaces, it's like a square mold, but this time in this public space in Cartagena, we used like a larger mold that had like the whole shape of these waves. And it is essential for this work that the sugars are mixed, and this usually happens collectively. So the idea is that people interact with the work, and very slowly these two sugars are like mixed in a way in which they cannot be splitted again. And there's like a very direct reference to Robert Smithson's understanding of entropy, and that's why the work it's called Tropicon Tropico. And this idea of collectively dissolve like this colonial pattern, it takes a metaphorical stance and a symbolic stance, not only on history, but also in recognizing our mixed culture. So in Marrakesh, because the museum was closed to the public, we had to think in a way of mixing the sugars to complete the work, and it happened through a performance in which a choreographer and a dancer created this piece to to materially mix the sugar, but to give access remotely to this, let's say, ritual of dissolving the pattern. And in Cartagena, it was not only people, but also the wind that helped to erase this pattern. I kept thinking about these patterns, and I moved to Portugal, to Lisboa. So I got the chance to go deeper into understanding this construction technique, that is a pavement made with stones. And it's very interesting how there's like a mirror between this history of water and the history of these stones. Because in Portugal, there are like different quarries, and each quarry produces a different color of stones. So in a way, in this, let's say, original square, we are seeing also a kind of geological history of this time the European continent. And I was tracing how this technique moved to different cities, all of them that were colonial places in the for the Portuguese crown by the 16th, 14th, and 16th century. But here this is a picture I took in Rio de Janeiro. It was, let's say, modernist architect who reproduced this technique and also reproduced this pattern of black and white colors. And for me, it was very interesting how this, let's say, geometric pattern was appropriated by several movements in Latin America in the 20th century as, let's say, a way of creating an artistic movements that were in a way distant from European culture. So for me, it was very interesting to discover how abstract art and geometrical art and concrete movements in Latin America, in a way, they were trying to be autonomous, but they were in its core like retracing like Western culture and colonial movements and colonial influences that after some centuries became invisible. This is another picture from Sao Paulo. And here it's very interesting how there's this other way of building this floor with these concrete slabs that in a way you can trace the influence from the Manaus Square, and from the Manaus Square, the influence from the Lisbon Square. This is a picture I found on the internet in Maputo, in Mozambique, in Africa, which was also a Portuguese colony. And I did the same in Macau. That is, it was a Portuguese city in Asia. And also I could trace how these patterns in Portugal were influenced by the Roman invasion and also the Islamist invasion before the, let's say, discovery of the American continent. So in a way, these patterns are like are traces of many layers of colonial processes and imperial invasions. I also discovered this very funny map that it's called the Columbus Exchange, in which not only these cultural artifacts migrated from one continent to another, but also certain plants were fundamental in this displacement of cultures. So for instance, tobacco was an American plant that moved to the European continent. Sugar cane, that it's an essential plant in Latin American history, and also coffee came from Europe, but actually came from other continents before. So for me, it was very interesting how this, let's say, vegetal migration was in a way overlapped onto this geometric migration. And I wanted to confront like these two layers of patterns and plants. And I produce a project that is called the La Migración de las Plantas, the migration of plants, actually in an art space in Madrid, in Spain, in which I produce fragments of pavements from all these cities. And to do that, I built these like movable platforms in which I was producing an abstract topography, let's say, as a basis. And then in Portugal, I reached this family of artisans that inherited this technique of the calzada portuguesa, as is known, which is this technique to produce these pavements that even today are present in every city in Portugal. And so in a way, these pavements over these metal platforms reproduce this abstracted topography and create these spaces, let's say these little voids within the platforms that in the exhibition space were filled with infusions from 5 of these migratory plants. So this is, for instance, the pattern from Sao Paulo that I show you, with a bottle of tobacco water. And this other probably is the wave pattern that I found in Lisboa, Manaus, Rio de Janeiro, with a bottle of coffee. And this installation had to provide this source of infusions. So it had like this kit in which these waters were produced on a daily basis, and the waters were exchanged on these platforms every day. And afterwards, I had this opportunity to install this work in a public space here in Bogotá. So it was interesting how these platforms travel by boat from Madrid to Bogotá, and then not only retrace this idea of like transcontinental migration, but also it was interesting to see these pavements like going back to a public space like this one. During the exhibition, these platforms can move. So the installation is like variable in its form, and several configurations can be produced with these platforms. Going back to the Amazon basin, this is a project that I did going back to Iquitos. It is called Bar Huerequeque. So you can see here how the city was established very near the Amazon River and how it grew in the last 2 centuries. And in Iquitos, I met this guy that is called Huerequeque. And I met him because he was one of the main characters of Fitzcarraldo, that is this famous picture from Werner Herzog. So Huerequeque was one of the main actors, and he was portrayed as the stereotype of mestizo, of a Latin American guy of like mixed heritage, mixed mixed, I don't like the word race, but yeah, well, I don't know how to say it, but it's a person that belongs to several cultures, and in a way inherits and mix like cultural let's say practices, not only in his own ethnicity, but also in language and religion. So this is, of course, an stereotype. And I was very interested in how this character was portrayed in the movie as an assistant to Fitzcarraldo, as a translator of, let's say, the languages of the jungle, and as a translator of the indigenous communities this guy was encountering. So one of the first things that I did was to take back this movie to Iquitos, because in a way the movie reproduced this colonial pattern of extracting something from the region without giving a return. So I did these, let's say, experimental projections of Fitzcarraldo on Huerequeque's body. And also I went back to some of the communities that participated in the production of the film. For instance, this guy in front, his name is Enrique. He was part of the production, but he never had the chance to see Fitzcarraldo. So it was interesting to bring back the movie to its place of production. And I also went back to the way the production of the film by the end of the 70s became like a historical moment in the city of Iquitos. So I went back to many of the, let's say, memories that the production of the movie left behind. This is a picture of Huerequeque with Herzog. And I also went back to the, let's say, the memorabilia that the movie left behind, especially for Huerequeque, who became like a local celebrity or a very well-known person in Iquitos for his appearance in Fitzcarraldo. And when I met her, he was about to be 80 years old. And he kept like going through his experience with Fitzcarraldo. But I also discovered that Huerequeque was an author by himself. He was a poet, and he created like many short stories of his migration into the Amazon basin. And this participation in Fitzcarraldo, in a way, obscure all of his own, let's say, narrations of the history of this place. He also was the owner of a bar, the Bar Huerequeque, who sometimes also serves as a restaurant. And I was very, very interested in this place as, let's say, as an architectural artifact, and also as a social place for encounter, and also as a theater for Huerequeque's stories. I was looking into El Bar Huerequeque and detailing its columns, its furnitures, its spaces, its structure as a palaphytic structure. And also I was looking into its history. And I really liked the way in which this bar in one of the ports of Iquitos became like a central space for the culture of this place. For some time, I didn't know what to do with the images that I recorded in Iquitos. I basically spent, I did like 3 travels to Iquitos in different years, and I spent like 1 month or 2 or 3 weeks each time recording the stories of Huerequeque. And I had this residency in Venice, in Italy, in the year 2015, and it was when I thought about like creating again the atmosphere of the Bar Huerequeque as a place to relate to these recordings and to the stories of Huerequeque. And later on, I did this installation in which I was doing this schematic reproduction of this bar that actually worked as a bar, and also became like a scenographic space to relate with these videos. Let me show one of them.
Estamos viendo la confluencia del río Amazonas con el Nanay. El Amazonas tiene las aguas rosas, y el Nanay tiene sus aguas tépidas, porque tiene de grandes aguajales y de pajeales. El Amazonas se forma pues con la unión del Ucayali con el Marañón.
I'm going to fast forward. So you can have a sense of what it was shown in these platforms.
En Europa la utilizaban para detergentes, para...
Es uno de los mejores actores en toda la película. A veces más fuerte, más convincente que el mismo.
So this project took, in a way, the documentary language, creating like different approaches on how to deal with these documents. Some of them were more my own, let's say, assemblages of images, and some other work as actually documents. So what we were watching was like a synchronized video on these 3 screens. In the first platform, that it was, let's say, the introduction to the installation. The second platform was these tables and chairs platforms that had installed these monitors on the backs of these chairs, which also serve as a place of encounter for people. But you could also focus on one of these stories of Huerequeques. Let me go over one of them.
Del amanecer con los tibios rayos del sol, poco a poco se disipó, ¿no? Y entre vellocinos de nibio color, verde exuberante y bella la selva pareció. La fauna alborozada le dio la bienvenida, ¿no? El viento con su largo le acarició su larga cabellera, y el río, esa líquida carretera, rumoroso y serpenteante amoroso besó su boscosa ribera.
So that was one of Huerequeque's poems. And then there was this third platform that was a projection of, let's say, a video essay I did with a more like personal tone to the project. Let me show you. A fragment of it. So I also produced like another version of this installation. This was shown at an art fair in Paris that is called FIAC at the Grand Palais. That is like a, let's say, very old building in Paris. But here I convert the other version of the installation in a maquette in which you could have like both scales of the installation. And a fundamental part of the project was a book that I edited with these poems and short stories of Huerequeque, which was my way of like giving a return to him for collaborating with me in this project. He wasn't very interested in these installation versions, but he was really interested in being recognized as an author and not only as a natural actor in Fitzcarraldo. So this was like a project, most recent one, that it was called Thoughts of Caffeine, in which I was taking this idea of, let's say, colonial exchange, migration of plants into a different trajectory. And I was before invited to produce a cup for a brand of coffee that is called Ili, that has like this collection, art collection, in which they invite different artists to produce like a cup that they sell. And I wasn't really invited because I was an artist, but more because I was a Colombian artist and I was regarded as an artist coming from a place that is known for coffee, among other products. And that was very interesting for me to think about how I was perceived as a coffee person, let's say. So I did some research, and I found that coffee is actually coming from Ethiopia, and it did like a very long way until it reached Colombia and Brazil and other countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America. So I follow back this track. I was invited to do a project in the Lyon Bienal last year. It has like two venues for me. One was this empty factory in which I thought about producing a space that was acknowledging this, let's say, history of coffee and practices of coffee. And I, let's say, work with this device that it was like a hanger for two different cameras. I use cell phones to record this travel. And I also proposed like this multi-platform installation in which I was like bringing back some of this interest I had before. So I was working with documentarian image, also producing this geometric pattern with an optical illusion. I was also producing a set of furnitures, producing two different installations, let's say enclosed installation, and also working with different objects and sculptures. So for me, it was interesting how people were, when they were like going into the central platform, they were becoming, let's say, actors into this board. And then they will be observing the installation on this double screen video. At the same time, they were becoming like part of this image of the installation. I'm gonna show you, let's go over here.
Pensamientos de cafeína. Lo arábico en el café tiene un sentido orientalista, porque su denominación obedece a las expectativas exóticas del mundo oriental.
Going through this geographical travel at the same time, I was reading a lot of books and watching documentaries and talking with people and approaching like different coffee producers and going through botanical gardens in Europe in which they have like traces of this migration of coffee. And I produced this video like collecting all the thoughts and notes I took along the process of the making of this project. And I was trying to relate different practices in relation to coffee, which for us in a way it's only one, but then I was discovering like several ecosystems and ways of like cultivating coffee. And also I shared like a coffee ceremony that is done in Ethiopia, and I got into this forest, another forest that it's called the Manquira forest, and it's the place which is believed to be the botanical origin of coffee. And I also visit like beekeepers that keep bees in relation to coffee, not only to pollinize these plants, but also to produce a very special honey that it's flavored with coffee flowers. Let's go back here. And I wanted to replicate this operation of, let's say, like putting like different histories around coffee into objects and materials. So this is a collection of chairs from different cafes in places that were central to this migration of coffee. I also work with the elements of the cafe, like the luminous sign. I work with these replicas in ceramic of different like coffee makers, not only like the ones that we know that are like Nespresso or the Italian coffee maker or the electric coffee maker, but also the Ethiopian coffee maker that it's not very known for us. I did this very little greenhouse in the space in which you could sit and have like a chat with a coffee plant. This plant was coming from the Botanical Garden in Lyon, and probably it's a descendant of some of the first coffee plants that arrived into Europe, also in the 19th century. I was interested also in the process of caffeine synthesis and how through this circuit of chemical processes we can extract caffeine that is actually the molecule that impacts our brain and our thoughts when we drink coffee. And I also work with two scientists from the University of Lyon to, in a way, deconstruct the aroma of coffee into like 4 different elements that are present in that smell. So this was, let's say, like an olfactory station. And then this project had like a second venue that it was a suburb in the metropole of Lyon, which was the site in which this happened. So this was a modernist urban project made in the 60s in Lyon. And after some years, it became like a place that could not be recuperated. So the major office of this little town that is called Rieux-la-Pape exploded these 2 towers, and they left this urban void, and they invited me to consider like an artwork into this place to, in a way, recuperate human presence and use and like activities within this place that became like a very desertic. So here my idea was to produce a platform in which we will be collectively engaging with this history of coffee and producing like different objects and sculptures and furnitures. For this, I work in collaboration with 3 different carpentry schools in Lyon, and also work with used furniture and like forestry, with the forestry department, that had like a reserve nearby. And in a way, we gave like a new life to this place.
Unless there's anyone with a pressing question that they have to ask. Anyone?
Kevin is asking how to do economically sustain your practice. That's the question. Like for me in the past years, I did like a mixture of applying to residencies, applying to grants, some engaging with galleries and selling. Not that much, especially these works are not very sellable unless you find like a very nice and interesting collector or a very nice and interesting institution that will collect these kind of works. Some of them had been collected, but some of them, I don't know if they will do anytime. And I became a teacher at the university here. So I think I mix like different things. And I also sometimes produce the works by myself. I try to approach as much as I can to the reality of a project before it's funded. And I think that producing or bringing an idea into, let's say, a watercolor gives the project certain energy in order to be fully produced. Working on a maquette, it's not, or a model, or a digital model of a space. It's not only a way of pre-visualizing, but also like in a way like giving soul to the project. So for instance, Tropico and Tropico, that was this installation with sugar, I spent like 3 years before I could produce or install it in a place. And after it was produced, it was easier to install it in other places. So yeah, so I try to produce as much as I can my own thing before I can look for external funding.
Well, yeah, I think we have to wrap it up, but thank you so much, Felipe. That was pretty amazing work, and it's great to have your insight on this. I think on behalf of everyone, thank you.
Hey, no, thank you.
Thank you, Felipe.
Thank you.
Goodbye, guys.